Welcome, everyone. I'm Jim Tolles. Looking forward to talking today about this topic of spiritual awakening and dealing with disorientation. I hope everyone is having a beautiful day or evening, afternoon, or morning, depending on where you may be and what time zone you're in. I'll take a few minutes here just to let everybody log on before I really get rolling. If you're brand new to me and you've stumbled across this live stream, my name is Jim Tolles. I'm a spiritual teacher. I blog regularly at spiritualawakeningprocess.com. And of course, I do these live streams here every 2 weeks, and they alternate between 10:30 a.m. Pacific time and 6 p.m. Pacific time. I think disorientation is kind of an interesting topic, and definitely at the outset of inner changes that can be quite surprising. So hopefully I can make it a little less scary, because ultimately I don't see it as a scary thing. I just see it as a transitional thing, moving from one way of understanding things about ourselves and about life to another. So as people are logging on, if somebody could just type a quick hello to let me know that you can hear me over in the chat pod, I'd appreciate it. And in general, that's where anybody can ask questions as I go along today. On the right-hand side of your screen, at least on desktops. I don't know where it would be on a mobile phone, but on a desktop, there's a live chat pod. And if you're logged into YouTube, you can put in questions and comments. So thanks for the confirmation. Welcome, everyone. And thanks to all those of you who have donated to me already for this particular talk and for other sessions. If any of you feel inclined to donate to help support me in this work, because I'm fully supported by donations, you can go to my blog, spiritualawakeningprocess.com, and there's a donation button on the right-hand side. And in 2 weeks from now, I'll be back at the 6 p.m. Pacific time for this next talk. I'll be talking about the misunderstandings that trap people on the spiritual path, and there's quite a few. There's just so much confusion these days, but yet there's this deep yearning so many people have for connection, for understanding themselves, for being at peace. But there's so much out there now, it's just kind of muddled. So it's kind of strange in some regards. We went not too long ago, maybe even 20 years ago, from this time where you basically had like one or two options, maybe just one, and depending on the country you were living in, really basically only one, or you would be, publicly cast out, or, something bad would actually happen to you. And now you've got the internet, and now you have more choices and ways to think about spirituality and practices than anyone knows what to do with. And I think that's created some interesting opportunities, but also some interesting traps. So that will be the topic that I'll get to in 2 weeks, and I hope you're able to join me at that time. So let's get started with the topic at hand, this spiritual awakening and dealing with disorientation. And by disorientation, I simply mean the inability to kind of orient yourself and towards life, to understand yourself, that you have a feeling where you don't understand something that before you did understand, and that can be quite unsettling. And I do want to immediately broaden this topic out beyond just spiritual awakening, because as many of you who are familiar with me know, I consider spiritual awakening to be a very rare thing and very specific about how I talk about it. And most of what people are talking about when they're calling it a spiritual awakening, they're usually talking about an opening, and they had an experience and they realized something. And that's great. But it doesn't usually keep moving them on its own. Versus the spiritual awakening has the tendency to just move you. It doesn't matter whether you're doing spiritual things or not, it just moves you. And that's kind of the key difference that I highlight. However, with any spiritual shift, and that's my overarching term for these inner changes, we can have changes in the way we understand ourselves and the way we look at the world. And that change in the mind can create these times of inner conflict between like our old way of believing and our new way of seeing. And that conflict is one of the ways that people can feel disoriented. And so when you're noticing that there's still this kind of argument between like, well, it looks like this, but I used to believe it was like that, right? That can make things kind of muddy and unclear, and you may not be sure which to choose, right? There's that habitual way of choosing, oh, it's this thing because that's what I've always been taught to believe it should be, and that's how I should believe, and that's, on and on and on. We make these ongoing arguments with ourselves. And then, of course, when we're having a realization of some kind, there's really the truth. And we're not sure what to do with that at first. And so there's that inner time frame where we have to kind of be in that sort of confusion and allow ourselves to be in that confusion and to keep looking at what we're seeing. Another aspect is where you just kind of lose the old entirely. So you don't necessarily immediately get a new understanding. So this won't be one where there's disorientation caused by inner conflict. This will be one where it's disorientation caused by the loss of that original belief. So if the original belief will take something like the belief that you need to be attractive or pretty or handsome or whatever we want to say, and then there's a big spiritual shift for you and it just drops away. And so now you don't have a belief around how you should look. And that can be extremely disorienting, and it impacts things, right? It impacts around what clothes you might want to wear or buy, or how you want to groom yourself, and it can lead to some interesting levels of confusion and disorientation around like, okay, so what do I do now? It's actually not a huge problem, but especially when people are new to these shifts in mental perspective, and that's really what we're talking about in the disorientation level. We're talking to a large degree about how our minds work. I mean, there's some body stuff we can get into as well. We're just not used to it, and we don't know that this is possible. And so since this is brand new, that kind of triggers that fear of the unknown. It's a topic I keep returning to again and again because it's such a common one for human beings. And we're like, what do I do? And this is scary, and I want to have that sense of safety that my beliefs gave me. I want to know what I'm supposed to do. And so initially, the advice for this is to sit in that space of the unknown and to breathe and practice relaxing into it. Say, okay, I'm no longer sure exactly what reality is, which for most people is really important. So I'm going to sit here and I'm going to be with like the most real things I can feel, which is my breath, my body, this present moment. You're sitting on a floor or a couch or a chair or something, right? Focus on the most real things there are, that there's no conceptualizing about it. You don't have to conceptualize about gravity. You don't have to conceptualize about sitting, right? You're just there, you're doing that. And that's one of the ways where you start to allow yourself to process what you're noticing. So in this way, it's a different kind of meditation because you don't have to have your eyes closed. You don't necessarily have to be doing anything in terms of not thinking, but making that space to breathe and relax and to let thoughts kind of continue to rise, so you get a sense of like what is just the habitual way of thinking and what may be some inspiration, some intuition that's now talking to you, is really an important part of starting to move through this transitional time. And ultimately what these transitions are doing are making us all more flexible. So more flexible in our minds, where our initial beliefs are predominantly unconscious and we cling to them like, a drowning person in the middle of the ocean does to any piece of driftwood. But that doesn't give us flexibility to deal with life, because life doesn't necessarily adhere to human beliefs. I'm sure all of you recognize that. We can believe things should go one way and then things in life go another way. We could all believe that, the ground beneath us should be stable, but if you're sitting on a fault line, earthquakes happen. And I've found that the more that, I rest in the present moment, that sort of reality continues to reveal itself. That you just see what's actually going on and not necessarily what you think should be going on. And it's really, really important that we understand this lesson, that our beliefs are not realities. And that trying to force our beliefs onto life, onto other people, is just the worst prescription for pain. I mean, consider borders. Borders can cause so much pain because we're just putting these lines on a map and saying, okay, people, you need to be here and these other people need to be there. And I'm not saying that there can't be some useful function to borders, but ultimately they don't exist. It's like there are plenty of places where like you won't know if you're in one country or the next because there is no line, because the border is completely made up. And yet so much suffering can be made and created over a belief that these borders are real or that they should look a certain way, right? There are different conflicted areas around the world where different countries are arguing about where the border actually is. And that's creating even more conflict. And there's plenty of other conflicts and misbeliefs and false ideas that are running around in there that make those things even worse and worse as you get more and more of these ideas all running around and running into each other. So there's a very real way that the inner work that we do has a profound impact at the global level, that we start to take out any sort of pain or misunderstanding that we're putting into the system. And that's an important change that needs to happen. And so this is why I think any sort of spiritual shift that leads to these moments of disorientation is a huge opportunity, where it's initially frightening, as I said, because we're so used to thinking a certain way and believing that this is just how we think and that this is the only way we can think. So moving into that transitional time where we don't understand ourselves or don't understand things offers us a unique opportunity to start to see life from fresh eyes again. It's an opportunity to come back to the present moment, because what most beliefs are doing is they're applying an old idea that we learned from somebody else or some other time period, and we're placing it again onto this present moment. And a lot of times that's completely irrational. And a lot of times, we're able to get away with it because a lot of life doesn't change that much, right? It just kind of has a certain level of consistency, and then at a certain point it changes. Like people often learn this with their bodies, right? You're going along, you're doing the same types of physical activities, and then something changes in your body and you can't. But then there's this old belief that says, oh no, I can still run like this, or throw a football like this, or carry these things, or walk up this number of steps, right? As people get older, certain things are just not going to be accessible because the body can't do it anymore. But we keep projecting this past belief of when we were younger onto the current moment, which creates frustration. So now we're getting angry at our bodies, angry at our limitations, and this is entirely irrational. So we need to practice this kind of internal flexibility. And the first time you're kind of starting to explore and understand that this is possible tends to be disorienting at first. Any of you who've had a lot of different spiritual shifts and changes and understanding, after a while you know that this gets more and more comfortable. You just have those days like, okay, so something's shifting inside. I'll just go slow down. I'll sit with it, and then things kind of shift. And you're more quick to start to key in on what's changed. You start to notice where kind of your metaphorical vision has gotten sharper, has gotten clearer. So it's kind of funny. I know I'm really being blasé about this, and that's probably just a sign of how many shifts I've gone through and perspective changes that have happened, because it's not really a big issue. It's another way where we can draw on these old beliefs to turn it into an issue when it's not. Now, certainly for some of you who are going through awakening, you can be in this kind of gray, hazy place for a while. I'm talking kind of days and weeks and months, depending on the shift. And it depends on how you integrate, depends on how much you're still holding on to past beliefs and wanting to keep those around. But I really want you to think about reorientation as simply a process of observation, not recreation. Okay, so this is a big distinction. When you're observing something, you're just looking at it and getting to know it. You're discovering it in the same way that scientists observe all sorts of phenomena. You're just looking at it. You're not trying to recreate some sort of new belief about it. If anything, you may create some descriptors. It's like, oh, I'm looking at a microphone that's sitting in front of me, and it looks like this, and there's this kind of metal mesh around part of it, and right, those types of things, right? That's observational rather than wanting it to be something else and creating a whole bunch of beliefs saying this is the best microphone that's sitting in front of me and nothing is better than it, and this is the only microphone I ever want, right? You see the difference. I'm still talking about a microphone, but now I'm recreating a new set of beliefs. I don't know what my old set of beliefs would have been in that example, but there are many ways that we do this. And recreation really is a sign that you need to go deeper in your inner work, working on the ego self, because what the ego will do during these disorientation moments, and this is something to watch out for, is it's going to grab onto anything it can to feel safe again. It says, okay, so this is weird. And firstly, you're already having a belief that's making you feel unsafe, right? Because you're not fundamentally unsafe just by not being able to focus particularly clearly. And so now it's going to be like, I have to have some way to understand life again. So what can I do to replace this old system? But the part of you that's wanting to replace that old system is still part of it, right? It's just a deeper part. And so we're kind of taking away, like, let's say the ego's first set of clothes, and it's looking for new ones. And it's looking for new beliefs that can make it feel safe again. The attempt to feel safe is one of our greatest issues. As many of you know, I outlined 3 fundamentals that basically drive the human animal that we still are and we have not evolved beyond. It's basically our main template or main foundation. That's the fear of dying, the fear of pain, and the drive to procreate. And so the fear of pain, the fear of dying, very closely aligned. I don't think they're completely mutually exclusive, right? Because if you're in pain, there's that sense that you might die. But sometimes, pain is worse than the concept of death. And that death seems like a release from things. So those are big ones, and they drive the ego. They create the ego. And so when these safety issues are coming up, that's just an echo of that far deeper issue and program that we have to get to. And you don't get to that program by giving the ego new clothes to make itself feel better about itself. It's another reason why sitting in the space of the unknown is so important, because you're starting to work on your own aversion to fear. And your own aversion to the pain of fear, because let's admit it, like, fear feels crappy inside of us. And it's not an enjoyable experience when that stuff comes up. And then some people, will layer different things on top of it, right? Well, then we'll get angry at our fear, or we'll get depressed that we're scared. It's like, so you get all these multiple layers of things that can be bubbling up. But then, when some of those things break down at different times, the different emotions or issues break down, that leads towards these perspective change, these moments of disorientation and revelation. Sometimes there's a lot of space between a revelation. Sometimes, as I said, it comes sooner, but it runs up against our old beliefs. And our ego starts to try and either barter between the two or pick sides. And you don't actually have to do either. Because the beautiful thing about reality is you don't have to believe in it. None of you have to believe that you are here now. If for a moment you stop believing that you are here now, you would not vanish. Right? That's that kind of human reality that we need to respect. And not run off into some of the crazy non-dual ideas, because sometimes people get into this, oh, well, nothing actually exists. And it's like, well, that's not useful. Right? That's usually just something that somebody only understands intellectually, and they're using that idea as clothes to hide from certain realities about being a human being. So this is a very practical path. You don't have to believe anything. You don't have to believe anything I say. What I'm pointing you towards are abilities that allow you to be here now. And it sounds strange to say that we need an ability to it, because we don't. But I suppose it's kind of the reverse, right? It's the ability to notice how we're trying to not be here now, and to let go of that old process. And so disorientation to me is an opportunity. And, let me be clear, there are many different mental health issues out there, and that this is not a mental health discussion. If there are those types of things that you're concerned about yourself, you should see a mental health practitioner. I'm extremely concerned about people self-diagnosing themselves through spirituality, and true spirituality embraces everything. So it's not going to cut you off from any means of any tool, any kind of help that's out there. It doesn't say this is okay to be doing this type of medicine, but not that, and this is just something that's very, very strange to me that has grown up in the spiritual world. And it's no better than the part of the scientific world that says, well, if it's not Western medicine, then just don't do it. So everything is an opportunity here to help and support you. Use the tools as and when you need them. But my experience, especially if, you've just had a realization and then you're going to disorientation. That's not a mental health issue. Once again, not a doctor. But as you sit there, the realization sinks in, you start to understand it, and you start to realize that it makes sense. Because a realization is a seeing of something that is real. Like real is in that word. Revelation is a revealing. You can only reveal something that actually exists. You don't have to believe in it. And I think that to me is always really encouraging, because I think it makes space for you to just allow. You don't have to read thousands of texts to understand truth. And that's a really beautiful thing. So I see people are questioning and commenting. I'll get to those shortly. I'm just kind of in that initial free flow. So thank you, and I will be turning to those soon. So we really are restructuring the mind, in my opinion, with all this stuff that goes on up top in our heads. And disorientation is just part of like the dust, in my opinion, where you're hammering away at something, things kind of fall down and break down, and then for a while it's kind of hazy. And so that's a good time to pause in your any sort of inner work other than your general meditation and taking care of yourself, to just let things settle. Say, okay, so something just came down and I'm feeling different. Because usually our bodies are pretty useful in all this stuff, where you kind of get a sense like, I feel different. Or I'm kind of seeing things differently. Sometimes it's almost like, it may almost feel like one eye is seeing things differently than the other. And so you just take your time, say, okay, I'm starting to see things differently. But then bringing more attention to the new part that you're seeing, it's bringing more attention to what's been revealed. You don't really have to do more than that. You'll notice that to hold on to old beliefs, if disorientation is coming from that inner conflict, that actually takes a lot of energy. That you have to argue, you have to barter, you have to think about it, you have to you get upset about it, right? So there's a lot of struggle that goes with trying to hold on to old beliefs that don't serve you. Beliefs like money, you have to have lots of it, and you have to have a family, and you have to have good clothes, and you have to have cars and houses, right? Oh, there are so many kinds of beliefs that people are clinging to. Beliefs like you can't be alone. You're not going to be okay being alone. Right? There's lots of different things. But if something is real, you don't need to believe in it. You don't need to believe in the ocean or the sky. You don't need to believe in the oxygen you breathe. Like, they're already there. And we need to understand that part of disorientation too will put the mind in its place, because the Western ego mind thinks it can do more than it can. It really has elevated itself to its own kind of godhood. It's kind of become a false idol. This thing of like, well, I can just think anything I want, and I can think and get whatever I want, and my thoughts change the world. And it's like, let's not elevate ourselves beyond what we are as human beings, these tiny little specks on this tiny little planet in this tiny little galaxy. And I know when you hear me say this, like, immediately starts to put things in perspective around the size, scope, and importance of things in life, because we're not that huge. Does our life, does our lives matter? Does it matter we're here? Yeah, that we're here. That's enough. We don't need to give it any more story than that. We're all beautiful human beings, and we can create our lives in so many really cool ways if we so choose to. But we also have limitations that we work within in this world. And that's something that no matter how much we want to believe our mind can overcome, we can't. We're just getting rid of our own problems, right? The problems we create for ourselves. And that's part of a very disorienting process for a lot of people. A lot of Western egos are thinking, oh, well, I can do all this. I can manifest everything I want. And then, you ask them, well, what do you really want? And if you strip away the ego beliefs, a lot of people won't even know what they really want. So it's like, well, how can you manifest that? You're living in a space of I don't know. And most of the manifestation is just another way that the ego is trying to make it feel safe. So ideas like that, all this stuff just starts to fall off of you. And it puts you into this really vulnerable place. And I say to you, stay in this vulnerability. Stay with it. Breathe. Keep coming back to it. When the ego runs in and says, like, I can't wait a minute more in this disorientation, I need answers, I need a meeting, breathe again and stay here longer. We don't need to make living so difficult. And most of our beliefs aren't true, and they just cause us more and more difficulty as we try to maintain ourselves and to make life conform to things that don't exist. So much of our minds have become a fantasy land. So running up against reality, when we've been living in fantasy land, can be very jarring. I think it's particularly important as we get better and better at creating messages that blur reality and fantasy, that we do know what is real. Like, there's all kinds of things happening in the world of virtual reality. And the way people are getting more and more immersed in video games and things that don't exist, that's becoming their reality, it's concerning. I'm not saying, playing those games is bad. I've played video games before. But more and more people are more invested in things that aren't real and so many different avenues of life that they can't handle a real issue. So this mental restructuring is just so important, to be in the space of I don't know again. To be in that sort of beginner's mind of saying, okay, I'm opening up to life. Say, okay, I don't know. It's like I have these beliefs and now they're washing away. Now, for those of you who just kind of have, more of a spiritual shift where something comes, those disorientation periods don't have to be that long. But I think you do have to bring more attention to them. That where awakening kind of does a lot of things for you, and definitely not on your own time schedule. The general spiritual shifts that people may have after like a spiritual opening, or some of you may even have a spiritual opening and then a shift after listening to me, right? Whatever is revealed to you, pay attention to it. Because if you don't pay attention to it, for most people, that realization will quickly be lost underneath the ego's general belief systems. It'll find a way to push it away, to ignore it, to find it to be inconvenient. And then that's one of the ways where some people will kind of re-realize things. It's like, I know I've had this realization before, and it just doesn't seem to stick. So in those situations, it's important to bring your attention there and to kind of actively support being disoriented, where like you feel this kind of inner conflict where the part of you still wants to believe an old way of thinking, but you just keep bringing yourself back to like the new realization and just supporting it and how you think about it. So I think in that way, being proactive with acknowledging realizations. This is why I talk about journaling, talking to spiritual friends and things like that. That's a way to integrate some of these things. And that applies to anybody, awakening or just a general spiritual shift of some kind. Because then you're owning what you see. And then that makes it also harder for the ego to argue back. Because sometimes, especially when you're talking, like I'm sure many of you had this experience where you'll say something that the ego is telling you in your head, and then you say it out loud and it sounds like the stupidest thing you've ever said in your life. And like, yeah, why am I listening to this again? Right? That's the power of your words and of bringing something out. When you bring something that's, real out and you say something about it, sometimes you'll just kind of feel silly because you realize that you didn't realize something that was already there. But other times it will just, reinforce it for you, where you're just like, yeah, of course, this is how it is. That we don't have to look any particular way. We can just be at peace with our bodies as they are. Right? Not a big deal. But clearly, plenty of people have beliefs to the contrary, saying, well, no, I have to look this way, and I have to be that way, and I have to be clean-shaven all the time, and yada, 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 right? All these different things that we start to believe in. And when they sit in our heads, they're very powerful, right? That's how the ego and parts of our assumptions hide in the dark. So I see a lot of questions that I want to get to here. And if anybody hasn't asked a question yet, feel free to write in the chat pod. And as always, please keep the questions and comments directed towards me, just because it's such a small space and I don't want to miss anything people are saying. Also, just kind of want to remind everyone and send a big thank you to those who've already donated to me this week. I really appreciate all the financial support, because that's how I get to do this full time and I get to do free talks. And if you feel moved to offer some financial support, you can just go to spiritualawakeningprocess.com. On the right-hand side, there's a PayPal donate button with a bunch of selections. So let's go see what people are asking. The first was coming from Will, and he's asking, my conflicts within myself usually revolve around beliefs about others and not allowing myself to be free for others, whether it be mentally or physically. I think I'm going to need a follow-up on what you're asking there about being free for others. Let's see, you said something at the bottom. You said, it's great to have someone so committed to see value in money and want to attain it and do something you see as special and the world does too. To enjoy it, remain open and pure and not get lost in it. Thanks so much for everything. I think that's a compliment to me, so you're welcome. Yeah, I'm just not entirely sure what you mean about not being free for others. From Annie, I had a year-long bout of jealousy due to recreating that pesky ego. Yeah, it'll do that. Sharon really likes what I'm saying. Pinar says, thank you for your service. After some ancestral clearings, I got open to energies. Now it moves my body in circles and evolves into a dance and then start getting messages through automatic writing. That's cool. All I can encourage you to do is to just keep allowing and to find space to settle. Yoga can be a good way to kind of settle the energy in the body. I consider these sort of body movements, and I wrote about it recently, I consider them temporary, and they should be temporary, where they're just kind of showing where things are kind of blocked and are trying to wriggle their way open. So it's a couple weeks back that I posted, and I called them energy-caused involuntary muscle spasms, and I made the acronym ESIMS for it. So you can look that up if you want some more thoughts on that. And then Annie said, oh yeah, it took a lot of work to try and force my marriage into a specific form. Exactly, right? Relationships are one of the worst ways where two people come together and they impose beliefs on each other. Now, not imposing beliefs on each other doesn't mean you don't have agreements and things like that. But I think the more you can strip away a lot of assumptions and just speak honestly with each other, then you can kind of find a mutual reality. And that really is that kind of sense of like, does what you both really care about, who you really are, really mesh well with each other or not? Because a lot of what's happened with relationships is it's the third fundamental, the drive to procreate, is mixed in there along with all sorts of romantic ideals and all sorts of baggage from childhood that's all lumped together into this mishmash of stuff. And so it's not about freedom, it's about trying to make somebody else act out a role for you. And that's miserable, as Annie is pointing out. From Tomas. Says, hi, I feel like I do not belong on this planet. I've awakened my kundalini. Is this state like not belonging here is permanent when you reach some point in spiritual evolution? I think I'm curious as to what the feeling of not belonging is about. I mean, that's where I would point you, because a lot of times we're becoming aware of how uncomfortable we are with ourselves. And so that's kind of the first step of noticing how much pain we're holding inside. From Pinar, and I apologize if I'm saying anybody's names wrong. So I'm not complaining, I just want to become a more clear channel, be able to help people like me, and I also figured I can direct these energies to help people in pain, don't know how to structure it. Well, I'll structure it by focusing the energy inwards. The deeper any of us can go in drawing up our pain and to move through these transitional time frames, those time frames where there's disorientation, the more clear we are just as we are. And some of these wants sort of go away. Some of these wants are actually the way we're talking to ourselves about needing to heal parts of ourselves. But instead of addressing ourselves, we start to find other people with kind of similar issues in different ways to try and fix them. Or if we've grown up in a situation where there's a lot of codependency, that sort of fixer mentality is already inside us. And so that ego issue is trying to find a way to keep acting out. And so it looks for other people to fix. And if before you're doing it in relationships, generally now you're trying to do it with spirituality. So inner work is just the be all and end all these things, that the more you can be clear with yourself, whether you help another or not becomes less important because you're clear in yourself. And these urges to help, they're different than the desire to help. And I guess that's the best way I can kind of describe it. Where the desire has to do something, the urge just is this kind of natural flow. And you just kind of go, oh, somebody needs help, old lady needs help crossing across the street, so I'll go help her, and then they go across. So there's nothing big about it and nothing to really brag about to anybody else. It's just something that starts to arise on its own. But really, focus the energy inward first. And that's just so important to keep doing it, because some of these issues don't go easy. I mean, you work on for some of them for years. And it's just so important right now to be healthy and whole if you do want to truly be of service to others. Because if we don't really know what that's like in ourselves, we can't teach it or help another. So Will was explaining his earlier things to me. He says, typo, oops, free from beliefs of what others think. Oh, okay. Like creating a block of myself because I think it can make someone else uncomfortable or angry. Right, so that's that people-pleasing issue that usually is stemming from a self-worth issue that's very common with a lot of people. So thank you for the explanation. That's part of, your inner work, is to find out where it is and how it feels in the body. Because if that fear comes up about, making someone else uncomfortable, but it has no fear attributes to it, right? It's not doing anything to the muscles, doesn't feel bad in any sort of way, then it's not really fear anymore. It's just an idea that's coming up and you don't really respond to it. And this is why, as always, I say breathe and relax. Come back to your breath. Change how the body is experiencing the present moment. And that's part of unhooking how the mind tells the body what to feel. I think that's kind of one of the interesting things around disorientation, is that suddenly, when you're going through a legitimate spiritual shift, your mind isn't necessarily telling you to be disoriented anymore, right? It's just kind of in that experience with you. And so it's kind of unhooked, rather than a lot of times our mind is telling us I should be scared, right? Somebody may not like what I have to say, so I should be scared. So that's the mind telling you how to feel. And then it's like hitting a button inside, right? And then the fear juice goes through and the body tightens up and you're starting to worry about everything you say, right? So that's one of the ways where the mind really makes us feel miserable, and that's why we have to restructure it. And that's why these disorienting moments are so important, as moments of transition. And that continues to lead us towards the flexibility in how we think. We can always go back to the old way of thinking. So the old way of thinking doesn't give us the flexibility to think in a different way. It says, no, this is how you think. As we let go of that and we open up more and more to just seeing life as is, we have the flexibility to think in any different way. And that's just a fundamentally different thing. And it's such an important thing that I emphasize over and over. I mean, flexibility is part of spiritual freedom. It's the ability to think, feel, and sense any way that you need to in any given moment, rather than being confined to a certain way of having to think and feel and act, which is what the ego does. And it's doing it because it's trying to keep you safe. And that's why, once again, anytime those fears around I'm not safe, when I'm feeling disoriented or whatever you're feeling come up, breathe into them. You need to start to break them down, because that's going to break down the ego's control over you. And the breathing relaxing works because the ego's control is a tensing of the body, right? It's the opposite of breathing relaxing. It's breath gets shallow, heart rate goes up, body tenses up in all sorts of interesting ways. Thanks for the questions and comments. Feel free to keep questioning and commenting here. And as we go after these disorientation and these disorienting moments come and go, you really do start to feel sharper. Like, it's just easier to think about life, to understand it, to see what's happening in front of you, and to interact with it appropriately. It's a clear space where so much of our ego selves, depending on what we're allowing ourselves to see, is a very blind space. It's very cloudy and hazy at times. Just Sharon. And she's asking, I have this strong belief that I need to be close to my family. If I'm honest with myself, I don't feel truly close to them, and we have very little in common. This has been causing anxiety and fear. I understand. So what you're running up against is that deep core belief that basically anybody with a family has that says the family is the ultimate important thing in your life. And because, for those of you who grew up and were raised by a family, because those are the people from those 0 to 5 years in particular who are there taking care of you. And then, if you're with them for 18 years or however long you're with them, that message is just deeply ingrained that your family is the most important thing in the world, right? They are your key to your survival. And that's just, it's not even necessarily said like that, but it's just so ingrained because they're the ones giving you food all the time. They're the ones who are giving you shelter. Even in families that are really dysfunctional, there's a certain level of needs being met, right? So even if you're beaten and emotionally abused, but you're still getting food and water and shelter, right? That message is still coming in. And of course, it's becoming a very confused message. The message being that, love and pain are intertwined, and separating those, it becomes a whole lot of inner work to do. So it's very normal what you're asking about, Sharon, about how family tells you these things. And so as you grow and evolve and you change and you start to see that some aspects of how family interact do not work or do not work for you, you start to run into this conflict. And all I can really say and encourage you is to be compassionate with yourself at first. As you start to figure out yourself, it's a different kind of individuation process where a lot of how people individuate from their families is in reaction to family. It's in reaction to either agreeing to certain things that they believe in or reacting against certain things that they believe in. And that's not really necessarily being true to you. So allowing something to naturally grow up inside of you intuitively around, this is who I am, this is how I want to interact with somebody. That's a different feeling, and that's part of what we're making space for. And at times, being around family is a wonderful opportunity for inner work because we're reflecting back these values and you can see how they're interacting and how they're thinking, how they're talking, and then you can apply it to yourself. So the family unit is always the gold mine of spiritual work for people who are raised with families. And I'm being general like this, not saying that's everyone, because I know some people are adopted. You have different caregiver situations that can happen for people. Some people feel more raised by a nanny than they do by their family. So there are very, very many different situations and set up different messages, and a lot of them just aren't true. So that's just natural. I suppose that's the shortest answer I can say, Sharon. And getting to know yourself is the most important way to interact again with family, because then you know how you want to interact, and that offers an opportunity for them to change. Some families will take that opportunity, some won't, and that's just kind of how that is. So for the next question from Megan, it says, I've been struggling with new beliefs versus old beliefs. My doubts and fears want to bring me back to my old beliefs because the familiar is comforting to me. I'm trying to embrace the unknown and have trust in myself. Your talk has been helpful. I'm glad that's been helpful. As far as fears and doubts, that's why I keep saying breathe and relax into what you're feeling, because the old beliefs have power over you because they seem to get rid of those fears. Familiarity is kind of one of our great our great traps, that whatever we were familiar with, we think is safe. But a lot of times, what is familiar isn't safe at all. So being able to be with your fear is fundamental to the spiritual path, to breathe and relax, but to not react to it. And that's just kind of where you're going to be for the time being. Anytime, you have these old beliefs come back and they're trying to make you feel better, you just breathe and relax and let those go. And when the new ones come, breathe and relax and be with those. Over time, you start to notice that certain beliefs require you to keep believing that they're true. And if you keep believing, then that means you're attached to them. And if you're attached to them, that means there's something you want from them. And so that's one of the ways you start to drill back into an issue. There's a question about what I think about Elon Musk, but that's kind of not in the scope of what we're talking about today. Tomas is asking, what does it mean if last month I have constant sweetness in my mouth? I think it's Amrita nectar, how they calls it. Does that mean that Kundalini detoxifying my chakras now, or I have a health issue? I don't eat sugar at all. I wouldn't presume to say. So long as nothing is hurting or there's no particular problem, I wouldn't worry about it. as I often say, I'm very cautious about assigning a spiritual meaning to every physical thing. There's lots of things that happen in our bodies, and there's lots of ways that things kind of change and shift around as we go through these inner changes. And a lot of them, like disorientation, don't require any sort of response if they're not hurting you. Like disorientation doesn't really hurt you. It's just a weird sense of not knowing how to engage with life that tends to be temporary. So another way to kind of think about disorientation as we're talking about it today is just like the loss of a measuring stick. Like the measuring stick allowed you to kind of evaluate, how far away something was from you or how long it is. And when that goes away, you're not sure how to orient to it spatially. But the good thing about this is that old measuring stick was wrong. It wasn't set up right. It had crappy units in it, right? It didn't help you orient appropriate to what was real. And so as you move through and you start to pay more attention to how life actually is, you get a better sense of like how to orient to different things that's more flexible and, in my experience, more accurate. So for anyone who's newly logged on, I'm Jim Tolles. I'm talking about spiritual awakening and dealing with disorientation after different spiritual shifts. And you can type in your questions on this topic on the right-hand side in the live chat. We have about 50 more minutes together. And I welcome your questions on this particular topic. And 2 weeks from now will be the next one. Will be misunderstandings that commonly trap people on the spiritual path. And that'll be at 6 o'clock Pacific time on May 31st. Have any of you had those moments where you move out of disorientation and got into greater clarity? I'd be curious to know. I've definitely seen that a lot myself and my students and other friends, and it's awesome. Because it just opens up your whole eyes and to a whole new world, and that leads you to kind of a new level of interaction, new level of integrating and connecting with other people and doing things in life. And that's another reason why the process is so important, because sometimes people want to get to this newness and this new interaction without coming into the new level of understanding. And so there's a way that people try to skip steps a lot. Or they're just like, give me a meaning for life, or what am I supposed to do? And it's like, well, that's still being asked from the old ego, and it's not organically coming up from you. It's like all of you have your most important answers inside you. And that's part of why we need to restructure our mind, is to get out of our own way. We're suppressing so many things about ourselves. We're not listening to ourselves. We don't want to listen to our bodies, our hearts. We only want to listen to them if they tell us something that feels good. And that keeps us trapped because life has joy and pain. That's just how it is. And Susanna's commenting, I'm in a phase of disorientation at the moment. Like you say, not really sure what to do. Well, like we talked about yesterday, it's time to kind of go within and to sit with that question of, what matters. That just kind of makes space to let go of some of these old beliefs. And that's usually what you're going to run up against at first, is you're going to run up against a lot of these old beliefs that you're trying to hold on to, saying, well, I can't do this and I can't do that, right? It'll be a lot of can'ts, or this is safe to do, or I think this is how I can support myself and make a living. And making a living really only matters so much as you're able to eat and have shelter and have clothing, right? That's something I think that gets lost in the conversation around money and spirituality, and I occasionally talk about that in these talks, where it absolutely matters your ability to get resources. And then after you've been able to take care of yourself, it doesn't matter. Right? And people who get lost in these, constantly hoarding of money and things like that are truly lost. From Megan, it says, you mentioned that if an old belief keeps coming up, that there might be attachment. Can you talk more about that? Yeah, if you believe in it and you keep believing in it, then that means you're attached to it and you think it's offering you something, whether it's offering you some sort of safety, emotionally or physically. You're committed. And so long as you're committed to it, that's kind of just pointing to a deeper belief behind it that's trying to keep you safe. That's usually what the ego is trying to do, keep you safe, and get you things that you want. As I said, the human body is very primordial, and so like there's a sex drive, and it's just trying to get you sex, right? It's not thinking or mindful. Annie saying partnerships where only one person has shifted. Is the question what to do in a partnership where only one person has shifted? Because in that case, I mean, you just accept that you've changed and practice being at peace with yourself first, and then see what happens. From Tomas, what's your opinion about dreams? Do we get answers from them about our path from the God? I would say that a lot of people push their intuitive understanding into their dream time because they don't make space to listen to themselves in their waking time. And so a lot of the work that I do is encouraging people to practice working on issues and opening to themselves and seeing what's real in their daily life. And then you don't need your dreams to tell you what you feel. But I think that's pretty common. A lot of people put how they really feel and what they intuitively know about themselves, they'll stuff that into the subconscious. And the only time the subconscious can talk to you is when you're passed out and asleep. So initially, some of those things can be useful, but if you're going to get into that, I recommend, some of Carl Jung's work and some of those other people who really get into the dreams and helping you to unpack the mythology of it, the archetypes that go on in it. Because otherwise, it's so easy for our ego to misinterpret things based off of what we want to hear about ourselves. Susanna says, I get confused about money because in our society you need to get a pension, right? Like you can be mindful of it but not greedy. Yeah, exactly. You can be mindful of it but not greedy. But you just have to be careful that you don't eliminate opportunities in your life because you think you can't make enough money at it. Right? A lot of people do that. They're just so quick to say, well, I love this, but I can't make money at it. Doesn't mean you don't be practical. I think anybody who knows me here and has been a regular student knows that I'm very practical about a lot of these different things. But there's a certain way that when we're really open in our minds, that we engage with practicality and these things, these callings of our heart, so that we can manifest them in a way that will support us. Like I'm living proof of it, that I've done this with spiritual teaching. Not exactly the type of thing and the way that I do it that I had any image of in my head of like what this looks like. If I had allowed like my old fears to say, oh, that's not safe or you shouldn't do it, then we wouldn't be here. And I wouldn't have been doing all this awesome teaching and talking to all these awesome people and having all these awesome connections, right? There's so much awesomeness in my life because I did not listen to that fear that would have said, oh, that doesn't work. Or how would you do it? And because I don't know how to do it right now, then that can't be safe or it's not possible. So I guess, the last little point about that, Susanna, is don't trust what your brain tells you about it is and is not possible. If anybody hasn't asked a question yet, feel free to do so. And, to some degree, you can feel kind of disoriented with the body where you kind of feel like spatially not sure where you're going. Those are good days to definitely not do a lot of stuff. To just sit tight and relax and let things settle down. There's plenty of people get ungrounded. And you can definitely get ungrounded by doing too much energy work. That type of disorientation goes into understanding yourself and what you can handle, because everybody is just kind of a different energy person. This is one of the few times that I might get even a little bit elemental, where like some people are like earth and you can blast those people with energy. In fact, they need it because that'll help them get moving. But if somebody is like air, right, that air element, they move so easily that they generally don't need a lot of energy and they don't need to do a lot with that. They just need to practice being more grounded. So as I said, I don't usually get into elements, but I find that a useful metaphor around energy. So if somebody is like, very easily moved by energy, you may want to step back on how much you do with that and do more things that are gently grounding with yoga or walks in nature, meditation, those types of things. So you're not just so lost in the energy and flowing that you can't engage or operate effectively in life. I suppose that also can happen with some people who are doing too many energetic practices. So if you mix and match and you don't really understand yourself, like you can mix and match if you understand yourself. Like I'm at a point where I understand my energy, and if I wanted to mix and match different types of energetic inner work through, like, I don't know, dance and Kundalini yoga, I could probably do that because I understand how I work. But a lot of the people don't yet know themselves enough to do that. See, it keeps coming back to knowing yourself, that this whole shifting, mental restructuring, the momentary disorientation is about being clear enough to know yourself. And when you know yourself, it makes it clearer what you want to do with different things. Now, the earlier we are in our path, we know less. And so do fewer things. You don't need to do tons of like energy work. And certainly you have to let go of the idea of getting somewhere. Don't try to get anywhere. Just be here now. Any last questions here? So I'm kind of winding down. As I said, disorientation to me it's actually not that big of a deal. It's one of the less interesting things because it's a transition that's a gateway to others. But when it first comes and you're feeling disoriented, our response can be like so upset. We're like, oh my gosh, I can't understand anything anymore. And later on, you're like, as I said, you just take a slow day. And then things catch up, and you learn to pay attention to what's being revealed to you. And that integrates it, and it's just easier and easier to let go of these old beliefs because they don't serve you. They're just fantasy. So time for a last question about spiritual shifts, disorientation, awakening. If I don't hear anything, I think this will be a good point to wrap up. And so as always, I'm blogging at spiritualawakeningprocess.com. And you can also follow me over at Spiritual Awakening Process on Facebook. I've got Gym Tools on Twitter. And I appreciate all the sharing people do because it's getting harder and harder to be seen on the internet. There's so much stuff and everything is becoming about paid advertising. So when you share, sharing really is caring. And I really, really appreciate it because it's just getting harder and harder to stand out amidst everything without having to pay for everything and advertise, which I'm probably going to have to do a lot more of, unfortunately. So thank you for all of your support, your financial support, the sharing you do. And thanks for everyone's questions today. And I hope you'll be able to join me back in a couple of weeks for the next talk. And also have a newsletter too. And there's a sign-up form on my blog, spiritualawakeningprocess.com, that you can do as well. So everybody, I wish you well. Thanks again. And we'll all gather around to the live stream in a couple of weeks again. Bye, everyone.